Man of God, come and share with us. Amen. Bless you.
Well, it's a blessing to be here. It's amazing some of the different relationships and just the networking that the Lord has. It's an honor to be here. I just want to start by saying that I never take it lightly when someone invites me and allows me to share from their pulpit. And so to the whole pastoral team, I just want to say I'm honored and truly honored to be here, and so thank you as the gatekeepers. And within my own head, I think of my background and where the Lord's brought me from, and even for me, it's a miracle that anybody would even give me a microphone. If you know kind of where I've come from, but it's a true honor, and and thank you all for coming out, especially some of those of you that drove. Is this the third time or fourth that I've seen you? It's been a few times over the years, but you guys are committed. So we do have a rich weekend, and I've gone ahead and tried to, in terms of the different messages, the title of the conference, Emmanuel. Do I have it in the right order? Emmanuel is Israel and Islam, or is it? I'm sure I have the order right. But I tried to break it up so that we are focusing a bit on Islam's role in the end times, that we're focusing a bit on Israel. And most importantly, and this is really the key, is that we're focusing on our responsibility in the midst of all this. It's so important, and actually I think just to begin, to contextualize a little bit of what we'll be talking about all weekend, I want to sort of just back up and just touch on sort of the recent history, the contour of church culture. Here in the United States, let's say, in the 1960s, we had the Jesus movement sort of. It really is probably the greatest recent revival that this nation has seen in terms of something that's impacted this nation and just swept a whole host of unbelievers into the church, but beginning out in California and then sweeping across, even really reached Europe. But you had the Jesus movement, and out of the Jesus movement, probably one of, there's a lot of different things. There were signs and wonders. There's all these a lot of hippies coming in, but one of the big factors, and I believe it was a significant factor in the midst of that movement, was Hal Lindsey released his book, The Late Great Planet Earth. And so what you had during this time was you had a whole bunch of people that were first awakening to just the reality of Jesus, the supernatural work that he was doing in their midst. But as they're reading Hal Lindsey's book and then looking at the scriptures, they're going and they're watching as the Roman Empire is essentially being revived, and they're going, this stuff's actually true. There's power in prophecy, and what it does is it validates this book. And when this book is validated, then its moral claims and, everything that goes with it is validated. And I'm convinced that biblical prophecy, if you will, is probably the most biblical, but it's probably the most powerful apologetic for the reliability of this book. And if there's one thing we want to convince people of, it's not, obviously just this book. It's the claims of their Creator on their life. But when people start awakening to the reality and to the accuracy of biblical prophecy, that the prophets spoke these things, then they start turning to this with a lot more seriousness, particularly in our time now when there's just such a wave of secular humanism and skepticism, and there's so many multiple trends merging to where our youth just, they really look at this as just sort of a bunch of myths and fairy tales. When you convince them that it's God-breathed, the biblical prophecy has a powerful, powerful role in that. But then what happened, unfortunately, is that, and God bless, the Lord used Hal Lindsey and a lot of other different teachers, but, there were a few things that they sort of got wrong. And so I remember when I first came into the kingdom, and, Again, I was really just raised with very little oversight. I mean, I was just a real little hellion from Boston, South Boston, and so suddenly, I'm in church culture, and Pentecostal church culture, and it was, just incredibly foreign. But so, I turn on the TV, and I'm watching Jack Van Impe, and he's like, oh, okay, here it is. We're at number 7, talking about the European Union. And beloved, when we get to number 10, this is it. And it was like, this thing was urgent. This was probably, early 90s that we were at that point. And everyone's just saying, when we hit the magic number 10, the European Union, this is it. And then it went, 11, 12, 13. Now we're like 21 or something like that. And, and Rex Ellis said, oh my, Jack. Anyway, so, I'm just watching all this. I have no grid for processing it, but it was pressing, it was urgent. And so, obviously that sort of didn't come into fruition exactly as we thought it would. But here's what happened, and I'll just touch on this. Forgive me, I have an issue with my throat, so I have to keep drinking water. I'm not like gluttonous or something. As I got my little bottles. But what happened, there was not only was this issue, if you will, of the European Union, there was also 88 Reasons Why the Rapture will happen in 1988. Harold Wisenant, I think was his name. And even, the truth is, even Hal Lindsey wrote a book called 1980s Countdown to Armageddon. So there was this huge expectation within the church based on a misinterpretation of, these things will, not pass away before, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. So everyone said, well, Israel was reestablished in 48, 40 years, 88, Jesus is going to return, rapture, voila. And so obviously that didn't happen. And so now we're coming into the 90s, and a cynicism, I believe, as a result of all that, set into the church. And so the church kind of went, all right, biblical prophecy, tried that. It was urgent at the time, it was pressing, but then it was wrong, it was sort of a distraction. And then a lot of the church sort of, during that time, sort of got swept up more into sort of the, the move of the Holy Spirit. There were a lot of different things that were happening across the earth. And the whole subject of biblical prophecy was sort of just shelved. And it was like, well, we believe these things, but it's kind of a distraction. And let's just wait and see, but let's not really take the time to give ourselves to the study of these things like we did for the past couple decades with that amount of urgency. And so there's sort of, and in my opinion, a real cynicism that has settled over the church. Now, in probably the last decade, it's gone even a step further to where a lot of the church, particularly within the charismatic movement, is turning away completely from premillennialism, which is the idea that Jesus is literally going to come back at the end of the age. There's a literal Antichrist, a great tribulation. He's going to come back and establish his kingdom on the earth from Jerusalem. In other words, premillennialism in a nutshell is you read the Bible simply at face value, you take it for what it says. And so now there's sort of this trending in various segments of the church to say, no. This whole idea of a literal kingdom on the earth, that's all allegorical. We should read that spiritually. The kingdom is now, 100%, and we need to conquer the earth for Jesus fully. It's all about conquering. And biblical prophecy and focusing on the end is a huge distraction. In fact, it's a misinterpretation of the Scripture. So you've got this whole trending, particularly among a lot of the millennials. And so there's sort of this caricature that if you're part of the church that's studying biblical prophecy and still reading it according to that old face value literalist approach, you're sort of a little bit, less educated. You haven't really gone to seminary. You haven't been trained to understand the subtle nuances of Scripture. You don't understand how Paul and Jesus were fundamentally reinterpreting the Old Testament and really destroying Jewish expectations and all these things. This is the language that's coming out of mainstream evangelical seminaries now. And so there's this real turning away from the whole subject at the very moment when the church needs to be awakened to the reality of what's taking place, you've got a whole generation that's looking at those that are as sort of, again, just less educated, sort of out of touch bumpkins, just sort of, they're not engaged in culture. They're not giving themselves to issues of justice. They're just, concerned with just the end times, the end of the world, negativity, escapism, abandonment, self-protectionism, all these things, right? Now, what's the problem with that whole stereotype? What's the glaring problem with that? The early church, the apostolic church, when the apostles were still walking amongst us, was the most apocalyptic of any generation of the church, fully focused on paying attention to the prophecies, paying attention to the prophets, reading them at face value. They weren't reinterpreting anything. They weren't abrogating or disregarding anything that the prophets were talking about. They said, no, this is going to be fulfilled. Literally, it's going to happen. Yes, when they said, Lord, at this time, are you going to restore the kingdom to Israel? He goes, it's not up to you to know the times or the seasons. The Father knows these things. He says, but you go be my witnesses, throughout the earth. The point is, yes, of course he's coming back. All of the Jewish expectations which were built on the words of the prophets, all of these things will come to pass. And so if there is one issue, one foundational issue that the church needs to begin with if they want to discern what's taking place in the earth, they need to begin with an understanding of the centrality of Israel in the ongoing plans of God and how we fit into all of that. And so much of what we'll talk about this weekend is about that. The early church was the most apocalyptic. They were also the most culturally engaged. They were also the most evangelistic. They were also those that preached the gospel with the most courage, laying down their lives more than any other generation. So you've kind of got all these, again, these millennials, these younger evangelicals, and they're like, no, it's all about justice, feeding the poor, human trafficking, and believe me, all those things are critical as part of the witness of the church, because in doing those things, what are we doing? We're bearing witness to the nature of the kingdom that he's going to come and establish on the earth. When the Lord comes back, it's the poor, the needy, the forgotten, the afflicted, the oppressed, all of those that are lifted up and healed and beautified and placed in positions of authority. Those that served out of humility, that imitated Christ, made themselves servants, will be given positions of leadership and authority. Right? So it's sort of this great reversal when he comes back. And as we minister to those that are oppressed, that are in prison, that are forgotten, that are hated, that are abused, we're bearing witness to the nature of the kingdom when all of those things will be taken care of by Jesus when he comes back. And then those that exalted themselves, those that clawed their way to the top, those that built their kingdoms here and now, that the politicians that are to put themselves in leadership positions to serve the people, they ensconce themselves in positions of authority for their own empowerment, their own wealth, the building of all of these things. And when he comes back, those that have exalted themselves will be cast down, and those that have humbled themselves will be lifted up. It's the great reversal. It's the essence of the day of the Lord and what's coming. It's all about justice. So you've got all the youth, they're talking about justice, and they don't understand the very heart of the day of the Lord. The very heart of all of these things is the issue of justice. And it's the best way to contextualize how we don't minister to the poor now because we truly believe we're going to eliminate poverty. We're not doing that because we're trying to take over the world. We're trying to influence the world as aliens and pilgrims and strangers here. And as we do that, we're bearing witness to the nature of the kingdom that's coming, and it's coming soon. So that's the background and sort of the context for all this. I believe that the issue of biblical prophecy, we understand the centrality of Israel, the centrality of the covenants that the Lord made with Israel, that he is still going to fulfill, the Abrahamic, the Davidic, and the new covenant, all made with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And those of us that are Gentiles, we get to come in and partake of it and be part of it. And with that, there's a tremendous obligation to honor and to pray for and to cry out for the people of Israel, the natural branches that have been broken off. So the church needs to awaken to all of these things. I just wrote a paper on a handful, there's probably several guys throughout the 1800s, all of which, simply because they were reading the Bible at a face value, literalist approach, just reading the prophets for what they said, they were clearly declaring with confidence that in the days ahead Israel would be reestablished as a state, as a nation, with a government planted back in the land, repatriated with Jews. And there was nothing indicating this back then. The Zionist movement, the early Zionist movement, really didn't begin until the end of the late 19th century is when that whole thing started sort of percolating. So you've got Charles Spurgeon, J.C. Ryle, Horatius Bonar, David Barron was early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, Adolf Saphir, Septimus Sears, S.P. Tregelles, Samuel Tregelles, and then I even found a guy 1,100 years ago, his name was Ishodad of Merv, that was looking at the prophecies and saying, in the end times, Israel will be reestablished as a state. Now, within the charismatic church, I'm sort of just bouncing all over the place, but within the charismatic church, the Pentecostal church, there are, I believe fully in the gift of prophecy, but you can go, let's say you can go online, there might be websites that catalog the various prophecies that are out there. And again, as part of the movement, I've looked at these things over the years, and I want to be careful, I'm not being cynical, but you look at some of them and it'll be like, 2014, this is the year the Lord is going to take us into new realms of His glory. He's going to release us into new release of His anointing. And I go, same thing was being said 15 years ago, pretty much. And I go, where's the real prophets? Where are the real prophets? But here's the thing. These guys that I just listed, they weren't prophets. They weren't like receiving an audible, but yet they were nailing it on the head. They were simply reading the words of the prophets. And simply through biblical exposition, they knew the future. Now, can you imagine when the prophetic church, those that believe in hearing the voice of God, listening to the Holy Spirit, when they get the foundation of biblical prophecy down? Because a lot of, and this is the thing, is the prophetic movement over here that, wants to hear the voice of God, and the Bible prophecy movement, it's like never shall the two meet. There are some segments of the church where they do. Thank God for pastors that have some discernment and balance. But really, it's a rarity. You don't see it a lot. And so, my heart's cry is that the charismatic movement, the Pentecostal movement, the prophetic movement would get the issue of biblical prophecy down. And then you add a little bit of unction of the Holy Spirit on that, and we would be a church that moves with clarity, that doesn't, that will be able to say, in this year, the Lord said this is going to happen, and then here's scriptural. It's not just sort of just out there subjective. And so there's been a divorce there, and there needs to be a reconciliation. That's a huge issue. But can you imagine how much information the Lord has given us if we would simply pay attention to the prophets? Because there's a tremendous amount of information. There really, really is. So that was sort of a long introduction. I want to shift into the message proper. I'm already 25 minutes in, but I've sort of I've trimmed this down a little bit. The subject that I want to talk about specifically tonight is what I'm calling Introduction to the Islamic End Time Paradigm. You could say the Islamic End Time Theory. You could say the Middle Eastern End Time Theory. Basically, what I'm wanting to do is to look at the Scriptures, and Pastor Charles was introducing this even in the introduction. And so you had the church in the 80s absolutely convinced that the European Union was this which the prophets spoke of. This is that, as Peter said. This is that was spoken by the prophet Joel. And so they were convinced that the European Union was the fulfillment, thus the magic number 10. Now, what I did is I threw up a map of the Roman Empire. And so I want to go all the way back to the early church, now post-apostles. The apostles are gone. We've got the early church writers. And a lot of the early church writers, it's amazing, it's amazing how quickly the Greek philosophical worldview crept in and infiltrated the church, and how so many of them were really just sort of Christo-Platonists. You know, they were sort of Christians. They were trying to merge Platonism, Greek philosophy with Christianity, and they right away embraced all of this allegorical, spiritual stuff, and they denied, you know, the literal interpretation of Scripture. But there were a handful of guys that were a bit more solid premillennialists. You had Irenaeus, Hippolytus, Lactantius, Victorinus. There's a handful that were, a bit more orthodox, I guess, or I say orthodox. They believed the way I believe. And so when you look at what the early church believed with regard to the coming of the Antichrist, his empire, and his religion, pretty much universally, they believed that he was going to come out of the Roman Empire. When you look at their writings, and they actually discuss this issue, they all believed he was going to come out of the Roman Empire. However, pretty much universally, they believed he was going to come out of you can probably barely see the red dot, out of the eastern portion of the Roman Empire. So this is sort of a dimension of the equation that's been lost in the modern church. So the modern church, when the European Union began, they sort of went, Roman Empire, right? And because the EU was forming, and then what happened is they forgot about the whole Eastern dimension because, again, the Roman Empire included a good swatch of the Middle East as well as North Africa. Now, this map is largely the Roman Empire at the time of its greatest extent. Over on the right, you see the Tigris and the Euphrates. In AD 116, under Emperor Trajan, there was a brief period where they did extend down the rivers and they took the ancient city of Babylon. And then Trajan had a stroke, and they withdrew, and Hadrian was the general at the time, who then became the emperor. He declared from that time forward the Roman Empire would never go further east than the Euphrates. And so sort of that whole section up on the top right of blue, which is basically modern-day Armenia, and it was called the province of Armenia, that was just forfeited. So they held that for a very short time, and really that eastern border was a bit more west. It hugged the coast of Israel, and it sort of shifted into Asia Minor. Let's see if you can see that. This it's Asia Minor. If you know Turkey, where it says Bithynia and Pontus, it kind of went into that region a bit more. So, the Roman Empire, you throw up a map, and the thing's always shifting and fluctuating in different periods. But the point is, the Roman Empire included a good part of the Middle East as well as North Africa. So if you believe the Antichrist is going to come out of the Roman Empire, that's fine, but it allows for quite a lot of leeway. And so what happened sort of within popular prophecy culture during the 80s as the EU was forming was there was a false equation that formed in the minds of the church which said Roman equals European. Now, Roman does equal European, but it's far more than that. You're limiting the Roman Empire when you just say European. And so then, when someone like myself comes along, and there's a handful of other guys that were sort of all getting this in the same time frame, they're going, no, wait a minute. You look at the Scriptures, and it's pretty clear, and you look at the early church, and they expected the Antichrist to come out of the Middle East, and they go, no, that's heresy. You go, what are you talking about? That's what the early believers said. No, because it's the European Union. You're not being, you're violating tradition. You go, tradition for the past 15 years, you know what I mean? Like, get a bigger picture. And, but that's what happens in our little church cultures. We develop an idea, concept, and then, we develop traditions very quick. So that's the backdrop. Now, I want to look at some scriptures which address this, because I personally believe that the Antichrist will come out of sort of that section of overlap, if you will, where the Roman Empire extended into the Middle East. But I believe that Daniel the prophet was speaking specifically of what I'll call the Islamic Empire, and it's really out of the series of historical Islamic caliphates, is what they're called. A caliphate is essentially a dynasty, an Islamic form of government, that he was speaking of, that final crushing beast that would devour, the whole land, the whole earth. And the point in all of this is to highlight the Israel centricity of it all. Because this is what happens with Americans as we start studying biblical prophecy, and, universally, everywhere I go, if there's a Q&A, where's America in Bible prophecy? And I go like, I hate to break it to you, but this book is not all about us. It doesn't revolve around the United States. It revolves around Israel, Jerusalem, Israel, and the Middle East. And we're kind of like vaguely referred to as those that dwell at ease in the coastlands. It's just kind of like, those that are whatever, watching Dancing with the Stars. And just dwelling at ease, we're sitting back in our lazy chairs. Oh, there's another Middle Eastern war, flicking popcorn in our mouth, and, turn on Fox News or whatever, kind of the bravery of being out of range. But to get the biblical context, and so really what we're talking about is a thoroughly biblically contextualized perspective on the end times. It's an Israel-centered, Israel-centric perspective. So there are really I'll say three pillars of the Roman view, of the Roman European-centered view. The first is Daniel 2. That's the Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the metallic statue. Then you have Daniel 7, which is really a sister chapter, which is Daniel's vision of four beasts. Now, they're telling the same story. Both chapters, both visions, if you will, are telling the same story. They're using different imagery to convey the same message. And then a big one that I run into constantly is Daniel 9, verse 26, which speaks of the people of the prince to come, and we're going to look at that. But universally, when I throw out the idea, well, I believe the Antichrist is going to be a Muslim from the Middle East, they go, Daniel 9:26, people of the prince to come. You go, no, I understand. Daniel 9:26. Like, no, I fully understand. No, and you're just like, it's this weird, strong, Roman, Daniel, And so I want to unpack that a bit, because I believe that I fully understand what people are pointing to, but I believe that when we unpack it a bit, that we'll see that sort of the understanding of the church was fairly surface, and really you just go a little bit under the surface, and it's pointing to something quite different. So I want to begin with Daniel 2. Now, again, the context here is that, the Jews are in exile. They're captive in Babylon. King Nebuchadnezzar, the emperor, has had a dream, and the dream has deeply disturbed him. He calls forth all of his magi, all of his court magicians and whatnot, and he says, listen, guys, not only do I want you to tell me what the dream means, he says, tell me what the dream was. And they're just like, oh, no. This is hard magic, Lord. And so then they go, well, wait a minute. There's this guy named Daniel, and he's really slick at dream interpretation and so forth. So let's call Daniel. And this is really the context where we pick it up. Daniel is standing before Nebuchadnezzar. He is actually gone. Basically what he did is he said, King, let me just sleep on it. And he said, I serve the God of heaven, and he'll reveal it to me, which he did. And so now here's Daniel standing before Nebuchadnezzar. He says, you, O king, were looking, and behold, there was a single great statue. That statue, which was large and of extraordinary splendor, was standing in front of you, and its appearance was awesome. The head of the statue was made of fine gold. So you get the first component is fine gold. And then its breast and its arms of silver. Its belly and its thighs were made of bronze. Its legs were made of iron. Its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. Then he says, you continued looking until a stone was cut out. So there's just a stone cut out without human hands. And it strikes the statue on the feet of iron and clay, and it crushes them. So it crushes the feet of iron and clay. Oh, I reversed the verses at the bottom if you're following that. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all crushed at the same time. They were crushed all at the same time, and they became like chaff from the summer threshing floors. And the wind carried them away so that not a trace of them was found. On the other hand, the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, biblically speaking, mountain is very commonly used throughout the prophets to refer to kingdoms. Mount Zion, the Mount of Edom. There's quite a few times it refers to a kingdom. So this stone becomes a great kingdom, and it fills the whole earth. But the point that I want to touch on here, and I'm just sort of skipping over this these passages, is really just touching on it, is the fact that when the feet of iron and clay are destroyed, all of the other empires, these represent empires, by the way, and Daniel will elaborate on that, they're all crushed at the same time. So the head of gold, the belly and the arms of silver, the chest and the arms of silver, the belly and the thighs of bronze, everything is destroyed all at the same time, and they all became like chaff, and the wind just blows them away. Now, the traditional view, again, down through most of church history, has been that this is what the statue is speaking of. The head is the Babylonian Empire. Daniel actually says, "You, O king, are the head of gold. After you will come another kingdom." We know that the Medo-Persian Empire came after. And then the Greeks, Alexandrian Greek Empire, and then the Roman Empire. And so this has, again, been the traditional perspective. Pulled this image off of the internet. So there's sort of the breakdown. The head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. And see if they've got there the kingdom of restored Rome. So it's sort of the legs of iron represent the Roman Empire, and then the feet represent the restored, revived, last days Roman Empire, and then the rock crushes that. I want to argue that I fully agree with the first three, with Babylon, Medo, Persia, Greece, but I want to argue that perhaps Daniel was not necessarily speaking of the Roman Empire with regard to the fourth kingdom with the legs of iron and the feet of clay. And the verse that I want to focus on is Daniel 2, verse 40. And it says, the fourth kingdom, now again, we had three previous kingdoms, now it's zeroing in it. It names all of the other kingdoms, by the way, in other places within Daniel. It never actually names the fourth kingdom. Now the problem is, if you open your Bible, it'll in the subheading, it'll say Rome, in the Roman Empire, in the subheadings. And so, you just, well, of course it's the Roman Empire, it's right here in the Bible. But, that was just sort of added after the fact. But it says, this fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch, and this is the defining characteristic of this kingdom, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all of the others. And when it says all of the others, what's it speaking of? Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece. So there's a kingdom that would come that would crush all of the others. Now, typically, what happens is people say, well, the Roman Empire, their soldiers, the legions, they were, they crushed. If there was a rebellion, they crushed it. They put it down. This is clearly the Roman Empire, the crushing empire. I want to look at that from a slightly different light. So beginning with what I've done here is I've sort of put a dot right on Babylon. Now, again, the dream was given where? In Babylon, to King Nebuchadnezzar, that was the king of Babylon. That blue area is essentially the Babylonian Empire. I've sort of just put a circle around the dot just so you can sort of have the geographic ground zero, the context, several hundred miles, the context of the vision. And he tells King Nebuchadnezzar, the Lord speaking through the dream and through Daniel, he says, after you, another kingdom will come after yours. So we need to understand that really contextually it was a very sort of Babylonian-centered vision. And it was concerning the kingdoms that would come after Nebuchadnezzar. So there's the first empire. The second empire, which of course did crush the Babylonian Empire, was the Medo-Persian Empire. The three dots there are the three capital cities of the Medo-Persian Empire. And that was a massive empire. They went all the way up into Europe, up into modern-day Greece, Macedonia, the Balkans, Bulgaria, and then all the way down into modern-day Egypt, extending down a bit towards Sudan, all the way over to India. It was a massive, massive empire. And again, clearly, it's the one that came after the Babylonian Empire. Then you had the Alexandrian Greek Empire, very similar to the Persian Empire, but he came out of the west, and as the vision goes, leapt across the whole earth and supplanted the Persian Empire. Then you have the Roman Empire. Now, the reason that I wanted to sort of put these all up there, and again, just as a reminder, this is the Roman Empire at the time of its greatest extent. It did, however, extend down, well, my light's not quite so bright, but down the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers and reached the city of Babylon for a few months. It was less than a year under Trajan that he did conquer that ruined city and then withdrew, forever withdrew. So within the 1,500 years of the Roman Empire, for a few months, it extended down and then withdrew. And so the thing that we need to recognize with the Roman Empire is that unlike the others, you had these thoroughly Middle Eastern empires centered on the city of Babylon, and then all of a sudden everything kind of shifts to the west, and it's very much a European empire that extends into the Middle East. And it's, how many you guys all know Sesame Street? When you were a kid, they would have does anybody get it? One of these kids is doing his own thing. So it'd be like a kid bouncing a ball, and then a kid throwing a ball, and then all of a sudden there'd be a kid swinging a bat. And it's which one of these kids is on his own. And you kind of look at these maps, Middle Eastern, and then all of a sudden the Roman Empire sort of stands out as a bit different than the others. Now, the only other empire that has ever arisen in the region in terms of its own entity. There were other empires. There was not the Seleucid, the Parthian Empire, and then the Sassanids, which were basically sort of an extension of the ancient Persian Empire. The Persian Empire never fully went away. After the Greeks withdrew, you had the Parthians and the Sassanids, and then you had others that came after the Greek Empire broke up. But really, the next major empire that came along is what I'm calling the Islamic Empire. Now, Muhammad in the 7th century burst forth out of Arabia, that's down in the Arabian Peninsula, and very quickly burst forth. And this is not necessarily the areas that were controlled fully by the caliphate, if you will, but these are the regions that have come to be dominated by Islam, where Islam is largely a Muslim majority. Now, it's working its way down Africa, and even today, nations that, once were, Nigeria is in the middle of just a major, of course, Nigeria is sort of over on the left, on the west, contending with Islam pushing its way south, and the church, we need to be praying that they would push back north and really reclaim Africa. It's amazing at what a crushing that is taking place in that whole continent. But really, Islam, it's amazing in terms of, did it crush all the others? Because this is really the biblical criteria. Is it which, between the Roman Empire and the Islamic Empire, which one crushed all the others? And, with the Roman Empire, you go, well, it kind of did. It partially did. It crushed maybe a third, for instance, of the Persian Empire. But, and yes, it took Jerusalem, which, so you have to sort of force it to fit a little bit. But with with the Islamic Empire, it's just like, did it crush all the others? Boom, absolutely, completely. And so in terms of weighing these two candidates, if you will, I'm convinced that the Islamic Empire sort of fits the bill much more in terms of what Daniel was describing. Now, the reason that I put this up, these are the nations that are Muslim majority, and then as it gets lighter blue, less so. But the point here in putting this up, again, Israel, here's Israel right there, the apple of God's eye. The point that we need to recognize is that this whole thing is about Israel. This whole thing is about the throne of David, where Jesus is going to come back and rule the earth from that spot. Now, if we understand that it's all about Jerusalem, it's all about Israel, that the Lord is not done with Israel, and therefore Satan is not done with Israel, this is pretty basic common sense, isn't it? You've got all these believers throughout the church, and they go, the Lord's done with Israel. And you go, well, if the Lord's done with them, then why isn't Satan done with them? And they're like, oh, you're just making that up. You know what I mean? There's just the rise of anti-Semitism globally and throughout the Middle East and even in the church. That's just, that's just because the Jewish bankers got their fingers in everything and they control Hollywood. Whatever. Then they start getting into all these conspiracy theories. And the fact of the matter is that Satan has always been after the Jews in every nation. There's never been a people that have been more persecuted throughout different time periods, different nations, different reasons, by different peoples, because the Lord still has a plan to glorify and vindicate His name in them. And so Satan's after them for that very reason. And if we, again, have the discernment of a log, we should be able to see that. And we should be in prayer about it. I mean, this is just basic, this is biblical faith 101. But so you look at that, you go, okay, right in the middle of that is Israel. All those dark areas are the regions that are now dominated by Islam. Now, if we have an Israel-centered perspective, you look at that and you go, how did we miss this? How did we miss this? We're all focused on Europe. Why? Because largely we're in the West and we trace our history largely through Europe, and school education and everything. And we just, again, we think that this whole thing's about us. We think the whole prophetic story, our history is God's history. And the Lord goes, no, my world history is a little bit different than what you've been taught in school. If you grew up over in China, the Ming Dynasty, you've got a different history that you've been taught about how you came to be. But the Bible has its history and its story, and it all centers around that city and that nation of Israel. And so it's just simple common sense. You go, this is the empire that has arisen, that has crushed all the others, that has completely crushed Babylon, Medo-Persia, and Greece, and it hasn't gone away. And it's still spreading, it's still crushing to this day. Now, Daniel 7, as I mentioned earlier, is a sister chapter. It's a sister prophecy with Daniel 2, and I just want to highlight verse 7, which is reiterating and telling the same story. It's using the beast now instead of the legs of iron. And it says, after that, in my vision at night, it's speaking again of an empire, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast. You had the fourth empire, now the fourth kingdom, now you have the fourth beast. Terrifying, frightening, and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims. So first it crushes and devours its victims. And then after that, it tramples whatever is left. I interviewed some evangelical pastors from Damascus this past year. I probably shouldn't even have said that. You just think of the Christians in Syria. You had roughly 1.8 before the recent war, 1.8 million Christians struggling, a lot of them traditional, Catholic, Orthodox, but there's a small struggling, evangelical community there as well. And they've held out. This used to be the heart of the ancient church. Antioch, Damascus, Asia Minor, Ephesus, that whole region. This was the heart of the ancient apostolic church. Now a tiny struggling minority. And now all these years later, the beast of Islam is trampling the residue. That which has been devoured, that which has been broken down, the residue, the struggling little bit that's left is being trampled underfoot. But I want to, again, unpack this a bit more. When we look at the Roman Empire, we say, does it meet that criteria, that description of the crushing, devouring entity? In fact, the Roman Empire, when we simply look at history, we know that it's well known for actually adding infrastructure. It was actually a nation-building ancient empire. It added law, it added order, it added roads, aqueducts. This is what the Roman Empire was known for building up nations. Now, again, it was just a giant revenue-collecting project, don't get me wrong. The reason they built the roads was so that they could send the taxes back much more quickly. I mean, that was really what it boiled down to. But that was really the nature of ancient empires, was a revenue-collecting project. It allowed its conquered subjects to maintain their language, their religion, their culture. Again, the Jews in first century, they had the temple, they were allowed to do their thing. Now, granted, they had to tip the hat, sort of bow to Caesar, again, pay the taxes. As long as you sort of did that, you were allowed to still carry on your own culture, language, etc. But much of the Roman Empire, in fact, was not really crushing all these other cultures. It itself was overwhelmed by Greek culture. In a lot of ways, it just adopted, the Greek gods. It changes the names and so forth. It was just the Greek pantheon of gods. Again, the Jewish temple prospered throughout, the Roman occupation, if you will, so long as they didn't get too riled up, which they eventually did. They were proud of their tolerance. The Roman Empire was a fairly tolerant empire in terms of ancient standards. On the other hand, you have Islam. Now, this is a map which details the early conquests of Islam. Probably can't read the dates, but Muhammad died in 632 Muhammad was the founder of Islam. So 7th century, 632, he dies, and immediately they start breaking out. So the dark area, sort of the black area, that's the areas that he conquered as during his 20-so-odd year career as a fledgling cult leader out of the desert. And then after he died, the general of his army was Khalid ibn Walid. They called him the Sword of Allah. And so then you have sort of that maroon or that brown area. Those are the areas that were conquered in a mere 29 years after Muhammad died. 32, 30 years. 30 years? 29 years. So here was the ancient heart of Christianity. Jerusalem, Alexandria, Ephesus. Ephesus, I guess, is a bit more west, but Antioch, which is sort of right in between the border of Syria and modern-day Turkey. Let's see if I can get that. Follow the dot. Right about there is modern-day Antakya. And I mean, this was within this brief period, the church just out of nowhere, this thing just explodes across the region and is just devastating the ancient church. We've got some statistics. And then, of course, within roughly 100 years, all the way up into Spain and all the way across northern Africa. So within 4 years after Muhammad died, get this, now in ancient times, 1/3 of a million, 333,000 Christians were killed. The next 10 years, 1 million Christians were killed. Again, in ancient times, these numbers are tremendous. They would besiege a city. Now, this, by the way, is based on Islamic early source documents. This is not just sort of like some guy who doesn't like Islam who's making stuff up. When you look at the early documents, their own scholars, as well as some of the early Christian records, this is clearly part of their record. They would besiege a city, kill all resistors, distribute the booty, and then march 30 to 50,000 women back to Mecca as women, slaves, concubines, whatever. Islam, unlike the Roman Empire, didn't want to nation build. They wanted to pillage and plunder. Islam was they were desert pirates. This is what it was, a desert pirate cult. I mean, if you want to put it in modern terms, I guess we still have some pirates. But that's the gist of what Islam was. In less than one generation, the ancient heart of Christendom was crushed. Within 100 years, 50% of global Christianity had come completely under Islamic subjugation. Okay, so this was the heart of the ancient church that is now completely in the process of being crushed, broken down. Any nation that you go to now, you go to Turkey, 72 million people, 72 million citizens, roughly 5,000 evangelicals. What is the chance of a Turk hearing an effective gospel witness, hearing about Jesus in an effective way? You think of that, 5,000 people to witness to 72 million. This was the heart of the ancient 7 churches of Revelation and Antioch. Syria, again, Iraq, unfortunately, after America went in and tore the place up. I mean, the Christians, a large majority fled, and then you've got this little struggling minority. Asia Minor, Turkey, I just touched on that. In the 1 year, now that we're bringing it up to modern times, treading the residue, with its iron claws. In the 1 year that the Muslim Brotherhood was in power in Egypt, over 50 churches were either destroyed or partially destroyed. We visited Egypt during that time. Pastor Charles, has Dalton been here to preach? He's been here, so you guys know Dalton. So we were in Egypt. At the time, Dalton was in Turkey. And then we met up and spent a few days in Egypt a couple weeks before the second revolution broke out, and then spent some time in Turkey. And I'll talk about that tomorrow, some of the travels and some of the testimonies and the neat things that we got to see and so forth. Since 2012 in Syria, over 100 churches have been destroyed. I'm sure that's gone up. Roughly 500,000 Christians have fled. And people, by the way, they go, Syria, why don't all the Christians just flee? I mean, the problem is if they flee, they go to refugee camps. and they get abused in the refugee camps. It's not like most of them can just move, just pack up, move to America. It's, if they flee, they can't get from point to point without going through 20 checkpoints and potentially being killed. And I mean, it's in a lot of ways, they're better just trying to hunker down and stay where they are. And, these things creep up on you. There's no easy decisions. Since Hamas took over Gaza in 2007, the Christians in Gaza have shrunk from around 3,500 to about 1,200. Wherever you look, that crushing, devouring, the residue. Another example, this was the Hagia Sophia, was once the largest church in the world, the big gold cross on top. Mehmet the Conqueror came. It was built in like 303. Mehmet came 1,100 years later. The Conqueror turned it into a mosque. That's it today. And then throughout the church, they just sort of have these big God, this is the nature of Islam, by the way. Is there anybody here when I say replacement theology that you don't know what that is? And I don't mean to say it that way, but is there anybody here that really doesn't know what replacement theology is? Most sort of. Essentially, replacement theology is the idea that God began with, he looked down, he chose Abraham, he turned him into a family, turned him into a nation, and he promised Abraham, he said, look, I'm going to give you the land of Israel. And he made all these promises to Israel, the family, the nation of Israel. And then, the new covenant, he said, I'm going to give you a new heart and a new spirit. And then replacement theology says, well, the Lord took that away from Israel because they were just so bad, and he gave it to the church. Okay, so we've superseded Israel. Now, the fact is, he's opened the door and allowed us to come in, but he still has a calling on corporate family of Israel. So anyone, now we're in the age of whosoever, everyone that confesses can come in, but he still has a unique plan to give the descendants of Abraham the land and so forth. So that's replacement theology, and it's been responsible for Christian anti-Semitism and violence against Jews throughout history. But Islam is the epitome of replacement theology. And the irony is that when Muhammad started his religion, he comes up against all these Christians that embraced replacement theology, and they embraced supersessionism, and he just superseded them. And Muhammad said, so you overwrote the Jews, well, I overwrite all of you. And then, by the way, because you add in that Islamic militaristic, triumphalistic thing, and so, all these Christians are espousing replacement theology, next thing you know, they're being massacred in the name of just another form of replacement theology. Sort of, the chickens have come home to roost. Anyway, sorry, bad joke. But, essentially, the replacement theology that we're espousing came back on us. And so suddenly the church is experiencing exactly what we subjected the Jews to down through history. This is sort of the picture of replacement theology. That, by the way, is the name of Allah. It's about 15 feet high, and they're just so gaudy. They're just stuck kind of all over the place, and they just patch them up there. And I hope my humor works, but what this reminded me of is this. That's me without a beard, by the way. Now, is that wrong? Is that offensive? Like, that is just wrong. You don't do that. But that's the essence. That's basically what they do. They're just like, by the way, Allah, Muhammad, the caliphs. It's like this was a center of worship for 1,100 years. The stories of the liturgy and the smells and the choruses that would echo through that building, and they just come in, and they just stick up that this is the essence. It is the essence of the usurping spirit, replacement theology. This is what Islam does wherever it goes. It rips off the Christian symbols and it just puts up the crescent moon and so on and so forth. Then I want to shift to the people of the prince to come, sort of the second great pillar of the idea that the Antichrist must be coming from the Roman Empire. So in essence, we're dealing with this verse that sort of gets pulled out of a prophecy. It's one of the most complex prophecies. It's the prophecy of 70 weeks, and we won't get into it all. But it's this one line that everyone zeroes in on, and it says, the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. And so what everyone does is they look at this and they go, well, that's speaking of 70 A.D., when Titus came in with the Roman legions and destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. Okay, so everyone, what they say is, the people of the prince to come, well, they say the prince to come is the Antichrist. So they say the people of the Antichrist will destroy the city and the sanctuary. So they go, the Romans destroyed the sanctuary, therefore the Romans are the people of the Antichrist. Okay, that's the logic. And again, just sort of a perfunctory, surfacey reading of that makes sense. Yeah, it says the people of the Antichrist will destroy the sanctuary. We know the people that did that were the Romans. History thoroughly testifies to that fact. There's just sort of there's Titus and everybody carrying off the Jewish treasures from the temple. Here are some errors, logical errors, if you will, with this popular position. It assumes the following equation, that Roman citizens were Italians, okay? And that all Roman citizens were Europeans. Now, that's historically inaccurate. And the reason is, very simply, because by 70 A.D., the Roman Empire, the Italians that had started this expansionist project, got lazy. It's real simple. And they go, why should we fight wars when we can make the provincials fight wars? When we go and conquer the Syrians or conquer the peoples of Asia Minor or conquer the peoples in modern-day Israel, we're just make them fight our wars, and we're just going to sit back and sit back in Italy and just pig out. I mean, this basically was the idea. And there's a pattern there, by the way. We're getting to that point now. We don't even want to send our own soldiers to fight wars. We just hire people to do it. But so essentially, first of all, the Roman Empire. I don't know if I threw up another map. The Roman Empire. Let me just give you an example. Let's say that I'm going back to my hotel tonight, and I stop at the gas station, and I get someone just whacks me on the back of the head and takes my wallet. And the police come and they say, well, no, I guess that doesn't work. They attack me from the front. I have to see them. And the police says, well, what did they look like? And I was like, they were Americans. They were Americans, officer. What did I just tell them? I didn't tell them anything, right? Because we've got every kind of American there is. Can anybody guess what I am, by the way? Good luck. I'm just like a big mix of all sort of things. I always say I should have gone to work for the CIA. I can infiltrate good part of the ethnos of the earth. But when we were in Turkey, the Turks kept coming up and saying, Assalamu alaikum? They like, are you Arabic or, Farsi? They couldn't quite figure it out. But the point is this, the Roman Empire, just like the United States, was comprised of many different ethnic peoples. Okay, and so it wasn't just Italians. You had Illyrians, Celts, Arabs, 15, 20 different tribes just in Germany alone. You had all these different peoples. And so the Romans started recruiting the provincials, and that's basically who made up a large part of the army. This project began under Augustine in like 15. So by 70, the overwhelming majority of the armies, particularly in the Middle East, were Middle Easterners. Now, the specific word in the prophecy is am. For the word for people is in Hebrew is am. Now, the Strong's lexicon lists the meaning of am as a nation, people, or kindred. Wilhelm Gesenius in his lexicon, Hebrew, sort of revered Hebrew scholar from the late 19th century, lists the primary meaning of the word as single races, tribes, race or family, kindred, relatives. Arnold Fruchtenbaum rightfully states we are dealing here with a bloodline, not a country. Okay, so the word there is, if the Bible means what, if words mean anything, it's saying peoples, the ethnic peoples that destroy the city and the sanctuary. Those are the people of the Antichrist. Okay, so yes, they were led by the Roman generals, but who were the peoples that did it? So when we look at history, I'm going to shift to here's an example, just by the way, from the Bible. Paul, he says, like, then the commander came to Paul and he says, "Are you a Roman?" He says, "Yes, I'm a Roman." Paul says, "I'm a Roman." In other words, that's an issue of citizenship. With a large sum, I obtained the citizenship. I was born a citizen. And then later, Paul says, "I'm a Jew." Okay? Paul's were the Jews. His citizenship was Rome. There's a difference between your citizenship and your ethnicity, particularly in the Roman Empire. There's just a handful of some of the different peoples that comprised the Roman Empire by 70 AD. So here's a statement. This guy's named Lawrence J.F. Kepi in his book, The Making of the Roman Army, From a Republic to Empire. This is one of those books that's like $150 on Amazon. Based on the numbers, you can tell that 3 people have read it. It was probably his thesis at Oxford or something, I don't know. But, this guy's sort of a Roman scholar of scholars. And he says that Italians were increasingly replaced in the legions, in the armies, during this period by provincials, those that were from the provinces, is itself no longer a novelty. Okay, scholars are in agreement. In the East, that's in Asia Minor, i.e. modern-day Turkey, Syria, and Egypt, it seems clear that local recruitment was well underway under Augustus. He died in AD 14, so that by his death, only a very small number of legionaries derived from Italy, or indeed from any of the western provinces, in other words, Europe. He says, under Nero, so now we're getting 68 AD, when the eastern legions required supplementation, it was Cappadocia, in other words, Turkey, Galatia, that Rome looked for recruits. This was the standard procedure. The legions of the East considered largely of Orientals, i.e. Middle Easterners. So this is just, modern scholars. Josephus, the ancient Jewish historian, he says, talking about the time when the Romans came and defeated Jerusalem, destroyed Jerusalem, he says, so Vespasian, that was Titus's dad, sent his son Titus, who came by land into Syria, where he gathered together the Roman forces. So the Roman forces had been in Syria. He gathers them there with a considerable number of auxiliaries, those are volunteers, from the kings in that neighborhood. Okay, so the armies came from the Middle East. Just wanting to establish the fact, Malchus, who was the king of Arabia, sent 1,000 horsemen and 5,000 footmen. There's 6,000 Arabians right there just from that one king. There were a couple of other Arabian kings that sent more auxiliaries. Now this is one story where the Jews were wanting to escape Jerusalem after it had been besieged. And what they would do is they would swallow the little bit of silver or gold that they had in order to try to escape, and they would get it, retrieve it later. The multitude of the Arabians with the Syrians cut up those that came as supplicants. So they come out saying, we surrender, and search their bellies. So one of them had seen somebody who, I guess he was trying to retrieve the gold, and he figured it out. So they started, anyone that came out, they started cutting them up to try to fish out some gold out of their intestines. Nor did it seem to me that any misery befell the Jews that was more terrible than this, since in one night's time about 2,000 of these deserters were thus dissected. So who were the peoples that were doing it? Arabians, Syrians. Now, we're going to come back to the issue of the Israel centricity of all of this. Now, what happens when I throw this out, people go, oh, that's all good and fine, but the point is, it was still commanded by the Roman generals. They go, yeah, okay, fine, it was mostly the Middle Easterners that did it, but they go, it was commanded by the Roman generals, so it really doesn't matter, it's all about the Italians and the Romans and so forth. This is an amazing little piece of history. Now, a certain person came running to Titus, the general, and told him of the fire. So the temple is on fire. Someone comes and they're running to Titus, and they go, the temple's on fire. He rose up in great haste, and as it was, he ran to the holy house in order to have a stop put to the fire. You see, the Romans wanted that temple to stand. It was a testimony to their tolerance and to the greatness of their empire. Titus didn't want to destroy the temple. And so after him followed all of his commanders, and after them followed several legions, and in great astonishment there was a great clamor and tumult, and as was natural upon the disorderly motion of so many people, so great an army, then did Caesar, both by calling to the soldiers that were fighting, and with a loud voice, giving them a signal with his right hand, order them to quench the fire. So here's Titus saying, no, put the fire out. And he's waving his hands around like a typical Italian. Is anybody, any Italians? He was thoroughly gesticulating. So, but now here's the final point that I want to look at. Titus, supposing what the fact was that the house itself might yet be saved, he came in haste, endeavored to persuade the soldiers to quench the fire. So Titus wants to put it out. However, yet were the regards they had for Caesar, in other words, those soldiers, those Middle Eastern soldiers, it says the regards that they had for Caesar and the dread of him who forbade them, it was not as hard as their passion and their hatred of the Jews, and a certain vehement inclination to fight them too hard for them also. And thus was the holy house burnt down without Caesar's approbation. The point is, given the choice between submitting to their general or submitting to this hatred of the Jews which possessed them, they couldn't obey Titus, and instead they burnt the Jewish temple down because of that hatred. And so there's the point, is that when we look at history, ultimately we can see by really the only historian that we have a good record of from the period, that it wasn't the Romans that ultimately did it. Yes, they were leading the armies. It was hatred, and it was specific peoples. Now again, the Lord is not, I want to be clear, the Lord's not like Syrians are bad or Arabs are bad. That's not the point. The Lord is giving this information to say, listen, the primary peoples of the Antichrist, Islam is essentially an Arab supremacist program, okay? North Africa, if you're an African and you're under subjugation to the point where you're supposed to name your child, whatever, some Malik or, Abdul something or other, that is Arab supremacism, okay? And that's the nature of large segments of the areas that have been subjugated by Islam. It's always been the spread. What do they speak in Iraq? They speak Arabic. What do they speak throughout large portions of North Africa? A lot of them speak dialects, but oftentimes it's Arabic. Why? Because it's been an Arab supremacist imposition. So the Lord is, I want to be very clear, the Lord is not a racist. That's not the point. He's not like Arabs, but he's giving us information in terms of the nature. It's the same thing that he did with Daniel when the writing is on the wall and it's mene, mene, tekel, parsin. And then Daniel says, he reads the Perez, which means divided, and it rhymes with Paras, which means Persians. And he goes, your kingdom has been divided, and it's given to the Persians. And the Lord's just telling us that this Arab supremacist religion, this culture that burst forth out of Arabia, it's far more than just Arab. He's giving us an indicator of which empire it would be in the last days. And again, both with Daniel 2 and 7, and then here with the people of the prince to come, it's pointing to the Middle East. But the other issue that it's always pointing to is the hatred of the Jews. It's pointing to this supersessionist, triumphalist spirit that Islam believes it's been given a divine mandate to spread itself throughout the earth. Now, that's the close of the message. The point is this. Again, in the 80s, people were looking at Europe. They were saying, this is that. It's amazing how when you begin looking at the scriptures with this more Middle Eastern, I'll call it again the Islamic end-time paradigm, how all of a sudden everything starts making sense. You look at the news, you go, this is falling in line exactly with what Daniel said. This makes sense. You have all these aha moments, and again, you come back to where you say, this thing actually is legitimate. And it's not just the Middle Eastern perspective, it's the Israel-centered perspective. Because what I've been accused of, by the way, is they go, well, this is what Christians always do, is they just point the finger and cast the latest political boogeyman of the day, the latest political enemy of the day is the Antichrist, right? The boogeyman du jour of the day. The Antichrist. No, you're the Antichrist. And this is not at all an American-centered perspective. Oh, like we're at war with the Middle East, with radical Islam, and therefore I'm just casting. No, this is a biblically contextualized, Israel-centered perspective. Has nothing to do with an American-centered perspective. In fact, for the rest of the weekend, particularly on Sunday, I think the first service, I have a message that I want to share, and it's probably my favorite message to share, but it's all about receiving the Father's heart for Muslims, loving Muslims. And so I just want to thoroughly qualify that nothing that we're talking about is intended to stir up fear or hatred or any of these things toward Muslims. The Lord wants to do among them what He's done for us, which is open their eyes to see the Father and to welcome them in just as much as this dumb punk from Boston, and make them part of this family as well. So we'll end it there. Went a bit long. Thanks for sticking it out. Tomorrow, we're going to jump into, again, some current events, share some of the testimonies, some of the neat things the Lord's doing, some pressing prophecies that are being fulfilled in our day, as well as I think I'm going to touch on the Olivet Discourse. I want to deal with the Olivet Discourse, which is Jesus' sermon on the end times, because it's one of the most misinterpreted and yet essential passages that we need to get down with some critical messages for us as well. So I'm going to close with prayer. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you that throughout the earth you looked and you called us and you made us part of your family. We ask that you would put a holy sobriety on all of us, that we would tremble before your word and the days that we're living in, that you would open our eyes, that we could look out and see that which the prophets spoke of, that is now the pieces are falling into place and coming into alignment. And your people, your covenant people, are increasingly being hedged in and surrounded on every side as the rise of hatred of your people spreads throughout the earth. We ask that you would give us the wisdom, the discernment, and the humility to stand with you and with your people in these last days, that we would stand against the rising spirit of the age, the propaganda and the lies of this age, of this whole system, that we would see things with your eyes, and that we would be a people prepared. We would understand the times, and we would know what we should do about it. We ask that you would teach us how to act and behave in the days ahead. We thank you for your goodness. In the name of Jesus, amen.
The vision and passion of Emmanuel's Church is to know Jesus Christ and to make him known. We pray that you have been richly blessed through this presentation, and we welcome you to visit us online at emmanuelswithani.org to see all of our online offerings. If we have been a blessing to you, please share us with your network of friends, and come on over to Facebook to our page and leave a testimony. Also, we welcome you to donate at emmanuels.org to sow into the ministry so that we can share the message with other people. Thank you for visiting us, and you are loved at Emmanuel's Church. We look forward to seeing you again.